Together we can. How to move climate solutions forward in 2025. As I said, my name is Elizabeth Bagley. I'm the managing director here at Project Drawdown, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathan Foley, our executive director. John is a world-renowned environmental scientist, sustainability expert, author, and public speaker. His work focuses on understanding our changing planet and finding new solutions to sustain the climate, ecosystem, and natural resources that we all depend on. He is our executive director at Project Drawdown. We are so thrilled to have him joining us today. John, thanks so much for joining. I'll let you take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Elizabeth, for the kind introduction, and thank you all, everyone from all over the world here today, for joining us at the Project Drawdown webinar. I want to apologize in advance. I'm getting over a pretty bad cold and sinus infection, so I'm a little, my voice might give out a little bit here, but I'll muddle through and see what we can do today. And let me share some slides. And as Elizabeth mentioned, we're going to have a lot of time for question and answer and conversation later. But first, I was going to give a little kind of overview presentation about the year we've just kind of been through. So again, thank you for being here today. And thanks for spending some time with us thinking about climate change and climate solutions. As you can all imagine, 2024 was a very momentous year when it comes to the issues of climate change. And I'm just going to speak to a few things that have been happening this year and maybe look forward into what can we expect from Project Drawdown, but also what the world needs to do to kind of move forward on the climate agenda in 2025 and beyond. But to start with 2024, where do we begin? Well, I think we begin with the science. The science tells us, yep, the warming of our planet is continuing. Sadly, we've had another record-breaking year of temperatures we've never really seen before, steadily increasing year after year after year. And 2024 builds upon the records of 2023 in very interesting ways. We began the year exceptionally warm, kind of much warmer than anything we've seen mostly in the instrumental record. And sadly, in the middle of the year, we've actually had the single warmest day ever recorded in the historical record happening so far in 2024. So that, of course, captured a lot of headlines and a lot of attention. But this is not really that unexpected in some ways. This is part of the longer trend that we have been seeing for a long time. So it's not like climate change just showed up in the last year or two. It's been part of a much longer trend going back to the 19th century. But if we look at the last few decades, we see a lot of different observations, all those different colorful lines showing us the kind of average temperatures of the planet increasing over time with a lot of wiggles. There's a lot of other stuff going on, what we scientists call interannual variability, or just kind of weather and fluctuations in climate that happen naturally all the time. But that steady kind of staircase of warming is still continuing. The black line is what the computer models, the projections of future climate change have been telling us. The colorful lines are the actual observations. Now, what we can see here is kind of an interesting phenomenon. Is from the, let's say, the 1970s through the 1990s, if we fit a line through that and asked how much was the planet warming, it'd be so many degrees per decade happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But after the 90s or so, we do start to see a slight uptick in the rate of warming, not dramatically, but a little bit between, let's say, the pre-90s period and the post-90s period. So the warming is still continuing apace steadily, but it's a little bit faster than it was before the 1990s. That's not a surprise at all. That's been totally expected and exactly what the computer models always predicted because of the natural feedbacks happening in our climate system. For example, as the Earth gets warmer, the snow and ice melt. And when snow and ice melt, they absorb more sunshine, which warms up the planet yet a little bit more, a reinforcing feedback. That's in the computer models, as is the increase in water vapor in the atmosphere and some other things. So this warming is right on track, it's expected, and so on. But there are a few things that did catch people by surprise. For example, there's a really abrupt change between 2022 and 2023 and continuing on to 2024. And there isn't a very good explanation exactly why that happened yet, and we're still sorting that out. But if we just zoom in into that period, we see kind of a big period where we were a little bit cooler than we might have expected in the 2021-22 era, and then jumped up suddenly in 23 and 24, which caused a lot of people to kind of wave their hands and say, oh, it's a tipping point, it's accelerating. Hold on, that's probably not what's happening. We had a lot of things happening around the same time. We also had a transition out of an El Nino event, which has a typical kind of warming and cooling polarity signal in the climate record. That partly explains some of it. There were also changes in aerosol loading, especially over the North Atlantic, also some volcanic eruptions and other things, but also, interestingly, some patterns of cloud cover changing across a lot of the tropical oceans. We haven't yet figured out exactly what's going on here, but it's not unlike something that happened previously, but in the other direction in the 1990s. So we have to have a better explanation of what's happening here. But again, 1 or 2 years isn't really the concern. What we have to track here is the overall pattern, and the overall pattern of warming is very much within the range of what's been predicted for decades now. So there are no big surprises here, just a lot of concern that we're tracking kind of like what the science has been saying. I would argue that we've not yet hit any sort of so-called tipping points, even though we see those in the media a lot because they get people's attention. They're sensational. But we are not so far seeing those kind of very dangerous tipping points really manifest directly on the climate. But we're maybe seeing some early warning signs, some things that would be very worrisome in the North Atlantic, around the Amazon, and a couple other regions, perhaps in methane emissions, but very early right now. So far, the bottom line is the planet's warming pretty much as expected. Nothing too surprising here, but it is worrying. And we're kind of constantly surveilling what's happening next. So that's really on the climate change, the problem side of the street. And you've heard a lot about that this year, but the thing continues. But at Project Drawdown, we don't focus just on the problem of climate change. We focus on the solutions. And so that's where we put a lot of our emphasis is what's happening there. Well, here there is some good news. Many solutions are dramatically accelerating, mainly because a lot of them are getting cheaper. Perhaps the best poster child of that is the cost of solar power, photovoltaics, solar panels either on your roof or out in big fields, whatever you look at. And we can see as we build more and more solar power in the world, the cost of that solar power is dramatically falling. That's good. That's what we call a learning curve, or like Moore's law. The more we build this stuff, the better we get at it and the cheaper it gets quite dramatically. So the total cost of installing solar has gone way down just in the last 15 years. The so-called capacity factor, kind of, how efficient are these things in producing power, has been steady or increased a little bit, which is great. But the real bottom line here is this. What we call the cost of electricity, the levelized cost of electricity, has fallen by almost tenfold since 2010. Back in 2010, solar electricity was generated around 46 cents per kilowatt hour. Today, it's under 5 cents, about 4.4. That's incredible. That's ridiculously cheap. This is now the cheapest form of energy humanity has ever created, and it's still falling in price. And it absolutely beats the cost of fossil fuels, which is phenomenal. That means on a level playing field, solar can beat fossil fuels kind of almost everywhere in the world, at least in generating electricity. That's fantastic. And the other thing that's great about solar is it's growing much faster than any experts ever predicted, including us. So I'm very happy to say we were wrong, as were everyone else, in forecasting the future of solar generation of electricity. And that every year the forecasts have been put out, whether they're purple ones or the blue ones or the yellow ones. Until recently, everybody was less bullish on solar, but it went from kind of moderate growth to what's really kind of become exponential growth. And we've been beating the historical forecast on solar every single year. That's really good news. And if there is a tipping point in climate change really happening in the world right now, it isn't on the temperature side of the things, it's in the technology. We're hitting social, economic, and technological tipping points where suddenly fossil fuels aren't as attractive as they used to be. That solar, wind, batteries, and so on are getting cheaper faster than anybody ever predicted before. And these similar stories are showing up again and again and again in certain kinds of technologies. Things that are small and modular and that can be mass produced. Things like solar panels, like LED light bulbs, like batteries, heat pumps, electric vehicles, all of these things that are small, modular technologies that can be built by the millions at a time are all hitting these huge success stories of a steep learning curve where they get cheaper, faster, better than ever. Think kind of like an iPhone and how disruptive that was. That's now happening in a few key areas of climate solutions. This is where a success story should be shouted from the rooftops because it's doing what we hoped. That market forces are now kind of helping climate solutions compete with fossil fuels on a level playing field, and money is following. You'd be a fool today not to invest in renewable energy if you're trying to add new energy to the grid. So the markets and investments are happening, and it's leveraging mostly pretty good policy over the years in the early R&D days, in the early kind of subsidy days, and even today with our Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. Good policies enabling this, but it's really being led by technology, markets, and investment. That's the good news. Now there's some not so good news on climate solutions too. Other solutions are lagging. I pointed out that the ones that are really succeeding tend to be small and modular and kind of built in one part of the world and can be spread everywhere. Again, kind of like an iPhone, kind of like Moore's Law, things like solar panels. Other solutions are falling way behind and getting too expensive, too slow, and too bottled up. Things like nuclear energy, carbon capture, high-speed rail outside of China, things like this that require billions of dollars of investment, those are lagging behind because we don't have those kind of rapid learning curves we see in more modular technologies. But one area I'm really concerned about where climate solutions are lagging is in the food system. Food is a huge sector of emissions. Between a quarter to a third of all the greenhouse gases we emit on the planet come from land use, agriculture, and the food system. And hardly anywhere are we seeing any real successes. It's a big sector, and almost every country is still increasing the emissions from the food sector. Why is that happening? Well, mainly because we're being distracted. We're not focusing on the real problems here, which is mainly deforestation, beef and dairy, food waste, and too much fertilizers. And we're not focusing on the real solutions, which would be protecting forest, reducing food waste, shifting diets, and changing fertilizer practices. Instead, we're being distracted by other kind of greenwashing in the food system that makes us feel good, but isn't really moving the needle on emissions yet at all. And we're also being failed by bad policy. A lot of governments around the world are heavily influenced by the food sector and agriculture, as we know. And so they're very reluctant to enforce policies that would really precipitate big changes that we need. So on climate solutions, it's kind of a mixed bag. Some things are working really well. Some things are still a bit stuck in the mud. So that's the kind of talk I would give you about the state of the world on climate change if this was November the 4th of 2024. It's a mixed bag, some good news, some bad. And that's kind of what I would have said as of early November. But then something happened in the world. I live in the United States, but I think it affects more than just the US. We had an election in this country and a few other things that happened since that did change maybe the path we're heading on next in some key areas. Before I get into this, I wanted to stress this is not partisan at all. We're a nonprofit. We don't get involved in partisan anything, but we do observe the world and we have to say what's true. And I'll just say for the record, my family comes from a long history of being Republicans. This is my parents meeting Richard Nixon in the 1960s when my dad ran for Congress. Thankfully, he lost. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have been born. But so this is not a partisan jab at anything. And we're not trying to confuse talking about public policy with being partisan or getting involved in electioneering. So that's not what we're doing. But it is a real fact that the election did change a few things. Our now president-elect has a demonstrated written record of spreading a lot of disinformation and climate denial. And this goes back a long, long, long way. For example, he also does this with linking incorrectly inoculations and vaccines with autism. He's been doing that for years. He's kind of denying climate change even exists. He talks about it being basically a hoax perpetuated by the Chinese to hurt US manufacturing. He's saying global warming is a kind of a hoax perpetuated by the elites to raise taxes, things like this. And then in this recent election, he vowed to promote fossil fuels, repeal many common sense environmental laws that even many Republicans support, and upend hard-won climate investments. Now, it's yet to be determined exactly what he will do, but the rhetoric of the campaign was very, very disturbing when it comes to climate change. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens in reality, but it doesn't look very good. At the same time, worldwide, we're seeing a lot more disinformation perpetuated through our kind of media channels. And the media channels of the world are frankly getting worse if you care about clear, factual information. We have outlets like Twitter, we have podcasts everywhere where every person with a megaphone can just shout whatever they want. And it turns out that just dividing us and misinforming us have become multi-billion-dollar businesses with even, whole state actors like Russia and others, deliberately spreading misinformation around the world, as well as other vested interest. And we have a lot of public voices who are spreading a lot of different falsehoods and conspiracy theories around climate, around vaccines, around food, around other things that really, really challenge kind of the fact-based world we should be living in today. So that's another disturbing thing that's happened and really reared its head late this year in new, kind of disturbing ways. All the while this US election and the spread of disinformation around the world are kind of accelerating, we see sadly that international efforts to, in the diplomatic area, to negotiate patterns of climate solutions around the world have really been lagging. The recent COP29 conference in Azerbaijan was very underwhelming, let's just say. That in the last couple of COP meetings, these UN conferences on climate change, there's been very little real progress. I think it would be a fair way to say that. Despite a lot of well-intended people and a lot of good effort, this is hard stuff and progress has been slow and maybe slowing down lately. So what does this mean as we close out 2024 and how might this inform us looking forward into 2025? Well, I think it's fair to say that we have to be ready for a world where leadership on climate change at the top, whether it's from major countries like the United States and others, might be lagging in ways that would be very sad. And at the UN kind of international diplomatic level, will also be lagging, at least for the foreseeable future. So if we're waiting for, the White House and the UN to save us, we might be in for some disappointment. Meanwhile, the rise of disinformation, and it's more subtle than it used to be. Outright climate denial seems kind of quaintly old-fashioned now. What we have today is a lot of kind of greenwashing, appearing to address climate change, but not really, and trying to serve the interest of very powerful industries and politicians to continue doing what they were doing before. So we'll talk a bit more about that and how Project Drawdown is trying to call out some of this greenwashing and disinformation. And unfortunately, science, at a time we need it more than ever, is being sidelined, not just in climate change, but in public health and nuclear security and AI and all sorts of very important public issues. Science needs to be at the table as part of that conversation to help inform and guide us into the future. But as we need it more than ever, we're sidelining it in ways I don't think I've seen in my lifetime. So this is a really critical moment, and we have to think hard about what we do now going into 2025. So when I think about what we can do going into the next year and the decade ahead, I think first we have to stand together. We cannot, no organization, no individuals, no individual country even can do any of this alone. And we're going to stand together and really stand up boldly for the future. And I want to talk about 3 areas of focus that we're going to be focused on here at Project Drawdown in the coming year, and invite you to maybe join with us in standing up for these 3 kind of key principles. But first, I want to argue that together we can, and I think we must, stand up for science. Why? Not just because science is nice, but we need it. In the 21st century, the 3rd millennium, we desperately need science to guide us, to tell us what is based in fact and with evidence versus what isn't. Otherwise, we're just listening to a shouting match of very loud, angry voices. For example, if you go on Twitter or whatever it's called now and ask, what are the best things to do about climate change? Everybody has an opinion. but does everybody have the evidence to show you what actually works? How do you determine what's just greenwashing or angry rhetoric versus what is actually true? Well, just like in medicine and other things, we need evidence and experience and experimentation in the scientific method to keep refining what we know. Science isn't the beholder of the ultimate truth, but it is a path where we help iterate towards the truth. We learn, correct, and through collecting data and experimentation, we find what isn't true, what could be, and continue to refine our knowledge over time. And it guides us forward. It can tell us, what works and what doesn't. It can help guide us to the best ideas out there. And when it comes to climate change, we at Project Drawdown have focused a lot of work using science to figure out what works and make recommendations of the most effective climate solutions that are available today. You all probably know our work in this area, whether it's the work we've done to identify solutions in electricity that can cut emissions, or the most viable solutions in food and agriculture, which to a lot of people are kind of surprising that it's like food waste, diets, and changing how we farm and protecting forest, or solutions in transportation, or all of these sectors. We at Project Drawdown have analyzed thousands of climate solutions, and we found just under 100 or so that we believe have proper evidence to support their further investment. Out of the thousands and thousands of things that we get pitched every day, we look very carefully at independent peer-reviewed data and do what we call a meta-analysis, where we synthesize all of the available information and assess, is this a viable solution or is it not? So just as important of what's on the list is probably what's not on the list. We don't tend to talk about that very much, but there's some very notable exceptions. And you probably should take a little pause if you hear a lot about a climate solution that we have not yet endorsed. It might be lacking a good evidence base for its success. But it's not enough to just talk about the kinds of solutions we might have and that are possible. The science also can help us figure out how to scale those solutions quickly into the future. It's not enough to have a list of solutions. We have to go out and put them in the world now. So that's why we have set up the Drawdown roadmap that not only describes solutions, but also how to scale them. By focusing first on the most effective solutions, don't waste time on things that don't work. That's really important. Focusing on the most affordable solutions, especially those that are cheaper than fossil fuels, for example. Everything below this curve in the so-called cost curve, these are solutions we've been analyzing, showing that about 80% of the Drawdown solutions are cheaper than the way we do things today, at least over a 30-year window. That is cheaper than fossil fuels or bad industries or unsustainable agriculture. Most of the time, these climate solutions end up saving the world tremendous amounts of money. So we have effective solutions, we have affordable solutions, we have solutions that are also really fast. When we look at the race against climate change, we have to also prioritize solutions that act as kind of emergency brakes on climate, things that can help us get us back on track. For example, cutting methane emissions in particular from energy, but also from agriculture, because those things are acting faster than the atmosphere than CO2 does. But other emergency brakes include stopping deforestation, because all the benefits of that climate solution happen on day one because you never cut down the rainforest. Or solutions around black carbon or soot, something that also contributes to climate change very quickly. These so-called emergency brake solutions are critical to success because they act faster than other solutions that take more time, like building out infrastructure, replanting forest and mangroves and nature-based solutions, or waiting for new technologies, which can take decades to mature, and 90% of new technologies never make it to the market. So we have to think very carefully about how we sequence climate solutions and emphasize the really fast ones and not too much on the ones that take decades to get here. We also can focus our work on solutions to be geographically targeted. This is a really exciting development. I'll mention this more in a minute. But we're now not just talking about climate solutions at the global level anymore. We're trying to now break them down to the local and regional level at Project Drawdown, mapping exactly where would a climate solution be most effective on the ground. For example, putting solar power around the world, a cheap and effective climate solution, does differ in its impact compared to where you are because of what was here earlier. For example, this is a map of every power plant in the world. Showing in the red dots are the power plants that emit a lot more greenhouse gases per megawatt hour of electricity, mainly powered by coal. And those would be the ones where if you replaced those first with solar and wind, for example, you'd have a bigger impact compared to the green or yellow power plants that are a lot cleaner. So we can target exactly where different climate solutions would have the most impact. Here, for example, in renewable energy, or here using new satellite data that track methane plumes. We can begin to literally name and shame a utility or a power company or a fossil fuel emitter or refinery and say, hey, you're leaking a lot of methane. You, whichever company it is, point out the facility and name it publicly to the world and demand that that be shut down. So fugitive methane emissions now can be documented from space in the public eye, not hidden behind fossil fuel interest. We can also map things like our critical rainforest habitats around the world and make sure we don't cut down more rainforest. We don't pay attention to tropical deforestation enough, in my opinion, but it turns out deforestation alone emits about 11% of the world's greenhouse gases. That's bigger than all the emissions from the United States, which are now around 10%. So deforestation is critical as a climate solution, and we can pinpoint the most important forests to protect around the world. We can also look at farming practices now in a much more detailed way using big data and machine learning. We can look at places where cutting back on fertilizers would have the biggest impact on greenhouse gas emissions without affecting crop yields. All the places in the tan and red colors in this map, for example, are areas we've identified as places where we're massively overusing fertilizers and could cut back dramatically without hurting food security. These are all more targeted kinds of climate solutions, and starting next year, we're going to present our climate solutions at this regional level, not just for the global average, and we're really excited about that. We also are looking at how climate solutions can do more than just address climate change, that they might have other benefits. Because, for example, when we cut back on fossil fuels, not only do we stop a source of greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, and other things warming the planet, we also stop one of the biggest air polluters in the world in terms of smog and soot and particulate matter that we breathe. And sadly, it turns out that the air pollution linked to fossil fuels, the air pollution that we breathe, is estimated to kill between 8 and 9 million people a year on this planet, mostly some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world. 8 to 9 million people a year being killed by fossil fuels on Earth today. And that's crazy. That's more than all the deaths in the world from tobacco, guns, and warfare combined. So when we phase out fossil fuels to help stop climate change, we also can save 8 to 9 million deaths a year from ever happening, especially in the most vulnerable parts of the world. So this is a leap forward not only for the environment, but also for equity, public health, and human well-being worldwide. So when we think about not just climate solutions, we need to think about their benefits to the world beyond just the climate arena. The science can also give us a bigger picture understanding of not just what the solutions are, how effective they might be, when and where to put them, what we get for them, but also how do we make them scale into the world? In particular, who can lead the way? If it's not going to be the White House and the UN, who else? And how can we make progress most quickly? Well, now we begin to have some evidence to look at and figure out how we look at moving forward. And when I think about climate change and moving forward in this very complex space, I think about chess. And in chess, you have a lot of different pieces on the board, all these different players, whether it's policymakers, business leaders, communities, individuals, professionals and practitioners, tech people, civil society leaders, culture leaders, and activists. We have all these different players on the board, and they all have different kinds of tactics that they can use to scale climate action, whether it's changing policy or rules, shifting the flow of money or human capital, changing the way businesses work, changing behavior, making better tech investments, and so on. There are many different players and many different tactics here. And so now, if we see the White House stepping back on climate change, and maybe the UN falling behind where they should be, That means a couple of players on the board are failing. But that doesn't mean you give up the game. Not at all. You just adapt, change tactics, and you keep playing. There are other players on the board that might have been more important anyway. Cities and states, investors, philanthropists, civil society members, activists, engineers, entrepreneurs, you name it. And if a key tactic fails, like international diplomacy or a climate cap and trade bill or whatever, if that doesn't get forward, you adapt and you keep playing anyway. You pull every lever with every player you've got. And so instead of maybe policy all the time, maybe we try philanthropy, investing, we innovate in technology, we use market tools, change the way businesses work, changing culture, all of it. So what I would urge us to do is to see the whole board, not to just rely on that one player and that one tactic to get the whole job done. You never win a chess game just with one piece. And we can't win the climate game from the opening gambit to checkmate without seeing the entire board and all the players and all the tactics. So that's how science can help us not only figure out what works, but also how best to use those tools and scale them out into the future. Let's look at the evidence, let's look at data, and help that inform our next steps. But science has another job to do too, unfortunately, and it's also to sometimes call out things that don't work. This isn't as much fun, but as I pointed out, science tells us what works, what has evidence, and unfortunately, it does also tell us what doesn't. At Drawdown, we, up until recently, haven't spent a lot of time talking about the things that don't work. We'd rather focus on the things that do. That's a lot more fun. That's what gets us up in the morning. But if we don't talk about the things that don't work, we're going to make some dangerous missteps and waste time, money, human capital, ingenuity, and focus. And so you've noticed maybe in the last year or so, we've been starting to call out more and more bad ideas. Whether it's the carbon capture kind of fantasy of the gas and oil industry, that somehow will just suck the pollution out of the atmosphere after they burn it. Incidentally, they use most of that carbon and pump it below ground to get more oil and gas out of their wells. So this kind of fig leaf doesn't work. We need to call it out and show it for what it is. It's a lifeline to the fossil industry to just keep polluting. It isn't going to work. We also have called out things like feed additives, where we say, oh, if we just fed a little bit of seaweed to the cattle, they'll stop burping methane. Well, it turns out when you look hard at the data, this is pretty underwhelming. It might have a few percent impact, but nothing like reducing our demand on beef and dairy in the first place. We've called out other things like vertical farms. They sound great, but they actually use more energy and cause more emissions than about any kind of farming we've ever invented. And we've also called out the overhyping in the regenerative grazing space. While that is a good climate solution, it's a very small one and only makes sense in a world of decreasing demand on meat and dairy and decreasing herd sizes. Because grass-fed beef take a lot more time, a lot more cows, and a lot more land than traditional farming methods. So we have to be careful about this and make sure we're not overemphasizing it and not let it be greenwashing the beef industry. So we're not doing this to just get clicks and get attention. That's not the point. We're trying to stay in course. So we're going to be telling you what does work, but occasionally saying a little bit more what doesn't and making sure the science has a voice there too. So moving forward at Project Drawdown, our science agenda is going to be really, really exciting. This coming year, we're going to be announcing 3 big areas of focus. Coming in June will be a very important thing called the Drawdown Explorer. This is going to be a quantum leap forward in talking about climate solutions, as it's going to produce far, far more data than ever before on the efficacy, scalability, adoption, and overall impact of climate solution, along with their co-benefits and economic factors. But we're not going to do this for just one number for the world. We're going to do it with maps and data that start to describe the regional patterns of how climate solutions are different, whether you're in Minnesota or Madagascar or France or wherever you are in the world. Kind of bringing climate solutions down to where you live is part of what the Drawdown Explorer will do and make it far more actionable in the real world. And we're super excited about that. We're going to also continue a deep focus on the food system. This is the one area of climate change that's been stubbornly stuck and sliding backwards, while other areas like in energy, materials, buildings, transportation are seeing some promising breakthroughs. The food system is actually getting worse, mainly through disinformation and kind of sliding backwards. And we need to focus on what actually will move the needle on the food system and its very important role in climate change. And then soon we'll be announcing something called Drawdown Nexus, which is a very exciting initiative that looks at the intersection of climate solutions and a whole new effort we're pioneering on building a drawdown, but for biodiversity. For the first time, we're going to be linking climate solutions and biodiversity solutions along with solutions to human well-being to look at that intersection between climate, nature, and people at the same time. We can't solve our biggest challenges in these areas by pretending they're all in silos. Instead, we want to bring them together and look at the interplay between climate solutions, nature solutions, and solutions that improve human well-being and human equity and justice around the world at the same time. So that's up for us in 2025, and please stay tuned. We're going to have probably the most important year ever in this organization coming up in terms of some big breakthroughs. So I think that together we can and we should stand up for science, not for its own sake, but how it can help serve the world. And together, working with Project Drawdown and all of you, we will. So beyond the science, though, that's not enough. I am a scientist. I love science, but I know in my bones that it's not enough to change the world all by itself. So not only do we need to stand up for science, I think we need to stand up for dreams. In an era where we're kind of stuck in nightmares of polarization, fear mongering, disinformation, and everything else, we have $1 billion industry trying to scare us and polarize us and tear us apart. But we don't have to be those people. We can be better than that. We can be the people we already are. Because it turns out we're not actually as divided as the media and the politicians tell us. It's kind of surprising, but in America, for example, about 90% of Americans actually already believe that climate change is real to some extent or another. We're not really divided on that. Take the 90%, it's a good win. Move on. That's not where the disconnect is, even though we're told that every day. It's not true. The disconnect on climate change in a lot of Western countries isn't whether we believe it's true or not, it's whether we make it a priority. It turns out in the United States, yeah, about 90% of Americans and Canadians and Europeans, and et cetera, believe climate change is real. But in the US, only about 2% of people will list climate change as a top issue facing them or the nation. Other things like jobs, health, inflation, security issues, those are always at the top of the list. Environmental issues are never going to be. But we can meet people where they are and talk about the solutions to climate change and show how they can be helpful in addressing the people's major concerns, like jobs, like economic opportunity, health, and security. So at Drawdown, we want to take a different tack about climate change. We balance the problem with solutions. It's not enough to identify a problem. You have to talk about what we can do about it. Otherwise, people feel hopeless. And in fact, you've done a grave disservice just scaring people without identifying what we can do about things. And those things are abundant. We also can meet people where they are as opposed to where maybe we want them to be. If only 2% of Americans care about climate change more than anything else, that's the climate activist community. Great, but it's never going to be bigger than that. The other 98% of the world actually cares about other things a little bit more. Maybe we should meet them where they are, considering they outnumber us 98 to 2. Maybe talk about things like job creation and the benefits to health and equity and security and communities and to children and to nature, things that everybody cares about. So instead of trying to drag people to where we are, how about we move to where they happen to be and offer to help them? And finally, I think we need to show a better future is possible because it absolutely still is. We don't have to just talk about the doomsday scenarios. Maybe we could talk about the scenarios that inspire people to show them a better future is still possible, but only we'll get there if we get together and work together. And that is part of our work. Even though we're a science organization, we've been told again and again that Project Drawdown has given people kind of a sense of hope, that they see data and an optimistic but fact-based view showing that yes, a better future is possible. We do have solutions. They're not automatically going to happen. They're not going to happen by themselves, but they can happen. And if we work together and show people the dreams of a better future, invite everyone to join in and build it, we can show the world a better way forward. And again, together, I think we can stand up for those dreams. Let's not abandon the dreams of a better future. Let's not abandon the path forward. And together, I think we will. And finally, beyond science and dreams, I think it's a time for us to stand up for climate heroes. And I don't mean the ones who wear a cape on a movie somewhere or on TV. And I don't mean like just Al Gore and Elon Musk or, Jane Goodall or whoever, celebrity types that we hear all the time. Instead, what about other heroes, everyday heroes, kind of ordinary people all around us in our communities, in our lives, who are doing extraordinary things? And I couldn't be more proud of some of the new work that we're doing around storytelling. Our Drawdown Stories work, led by Matt Scott and our amazing stories team, is championing the stories of climate heroines and heroes around the world. These are just regular folks doing amazing things. And we're also making sure to pass the microphone to people who haven't been heard as much, especially people of color, women, others who haven't had the same spotlight and the same stage as maybe others have had in the past. And we've been building story after story after story, going around first around cities in the United States, already covering 6 regions, creating short films of amazing people doing incredible things. And this kind of neighborhood by neighborhood storytelling has been growing beautifully over the last 2 years. And just recently, we launched a new initiative called the Global Solutions Diary, which you can find on our website. And it allows you to upload your own story about climate solutions, just invites the world to share in conversation, just uploading a little video from your phone. And it's already had, just in a few weeks, incredible stories popping up from all around the world that just inform and inspire us and show us that not all is lost. Maybe the folks on Twitter, maybe our politicians want to tell us how bad everything is, but these people show us what good looks like and what it can be. And these heroes remind us that an incredible world is within reach still, and they're on the front lines every day making it happen. They're reminding us that it is not game over, it's game on. We should join these heroes, celebrate these heroes, help amplify their work, share it with others, and to be bold. So I think it's time, inspired by these heroes, to build the future we want, not the future the doomsday people tell us we're going to have or the politicians manipulate us into fearing. Let's build a future we want, a future that's guided by science, but inspired by dreams of a better future, and truly inspired by the heroes all around us. So that's really kind of where we are today. And that's how I'm looking at the next year. This moment demands, I believe, that we all stand up and that we stand together. And I'll make you this promise right now, is that we at Project Drawdown, this is our fantastic team of people joining our organization. It's growing a little bit more, and we're now the biggest we've ever been. We will stand up, and we'll stand up for these issues for sure. But more importantly, we want to stand up with you and yours and all the teams that you're involved with as well. That this is going to take something where we all work together. And together, I think we can change the world. And if we really, really stand up and do this right, together, we will. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you for your time and attention today. And I believe we have a good 10 minutes or maybe a little bit more to have some Q&A and conversation with everybody. So I'll stop the slides here and I'll hand it back to Elizabeth to help maybe showcase a few of the questions that have come up or a few comments, and we'll go from here.
Oh, great. First, everybody, let's give John a big virtual round of applause. Thank you so much, John, for sharing what's next, the view ahead for 2025. Look at all those. Wow. Okay. Lots of emojis. Thanks, everybody. Just so you know, we had folks from all over the world here today, topping over 500 people. So thanks, everybody, for signing in. John, we've got a whole range of questions like we usually have. Apologies in advance to folks that we're not able to get to all of them or necessarily able to get to any really nuanced specific question necessarily. But I wanted to start with a question that someone wrote, that the scientific knowledge focused on climate is invaluable. What is Drawdown doing to spread its partnership and its relationships to leverage this knowledge?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we're a tiny team compared to the size of the problem we're trying to address, and I'm really proud that we punched way out of our weight class. That's for sure. A small little band here is having a big impact, but we can be so much more effective when we partner. And so we're always looking for opportunities to partner, to share our information, what we've learned to others, so it can be more effective. And so at Drawdown, we talk about the three S's. We do science, but we have to make sure it gets in the hands of stakeholders, community leaders, business leaders, activists, politicians, philanthropists, you name it. We want to make sure stakeholders really get the science and it's not stuck in the ivory tower. We don't publish in academic journals behind obscure jargon. I used to do that for a living. I was an academic for years, but we busted out of the ivory tower. We escaped and we're trying to get this stuff into the world. So we're always looking for ways to do that, but also to use the power of storytelling. That isn't just facts and figures and kind of dry language, but also, hey, there's a person who I can relate to, somebody like me who's doing something kind of amazing with this science. So that's how we're trying to move forward. And we're always eager to look for new partnerships and new ways of collaborating. And so we'll keep our eyes open and look forward to your suggestions about how we can do even more. Again, we're small, we can't do everything, but we try hard to figure out how we can do the most strategic kind of partnerships possible. That's so important today.
Thanks for that, John. And for those folks asking, yes, this was recorded. Yes, you will get a copy. Yes, it will also be on YouTube. So don't worry, you can rewatch, you can share, and we're grateful to you for wanting to spread this message. So thanks everybody for asking for that. And all of the links that I put into the chat will also be in a follow-up email as well as in the YouTube notes. So that aside, John, there's a number of questions about emergency brakes. So one question was, what sort of actions do you consider effective and feasible in the category of emergency brakes? And then there was a focus from some folks specifically on the emergency brake of stopping tropical deforestation. So I wonder if you could speak a bit about emergency brakes.
Yeah, it turns out that climate change is a time problem more than it is a technology problem. We only have so many years left to kind of really bend the curve on climate change, and every year added together really matters. So at Drawdown, we always say now is more important than new, and time is always more important than tech. So waiting for 2050 to finally crack the code on fusion reactors or waiting for magical carbon capture machines to suck it out of the sky is folly. It doesn't work. You have already lost the planet by the time those things ever get to meaningful scale. So we have to prioritize solutions that are here today. So a friend of mine, Ibrahim El-Husani, said once, if your house is on fire, you grab the hose and you grab the bucket. You don't talk about disrupting the fire suppression business. It's too late. You've got to do it now. So we pull the emergency brakes, so to speak, out of the list of climate solutions because they're even faster. Of all the climate solutions we have already identified, they fall into three big categories with respect to speed. We have emergency brakes that are super fast. We have the nominal solutions that are kind of like, yep, they're going just as you would expect, like putting up a solar panel instead of a coal power plant. You'll get a little bit of impact every single year and it'll build up like a straight line into the future. And then we have the slower climate solutions, things like planting new trees that might take 30 to 40 years to build up, or storing carbon in soils that take decades to accumulate carbon. Those are going to be a little bit slower. But the emergency brakes, because of science, we've learned that some things will act more quickly in stopping future warming rates. For example, methane. Anything to do with methane is automatically a big emergency brake because methane heats the planet really hard and really fast. Unlike CO2, methane only lives in the atmosphere for about 10 to 20 years, but it packs a big wallop of heat in those 10 to 20 years, and the heat lasts for centuries. So the impact of methane is kind of immediate, but it has an echo into the future. So stopping methane emissions is probably the biggest single thing we can do to kind of get back on course right now. Not to, it doesn't mean don't focus on CO2, it means just put a little more effort into methane as well. So that's why we talk about methane from cattle, from landfills, from wastewater treatment facilities, from pipelines and coal mines and refineries. Plug those leaks, and those satellites are beginning to help show us where they are. So I'm pretty bullish on methane these days. But also deforestation. Now, deforestation, I mentioned, it's big. It's 11% of the world's emissions, more than the entire United States. We're now around 10. China's around 30%. Deforestation is around 11. The US is around 10. So these are kind of the big numbers we're talking about. And deforestation could stop today. We could do it today. It has nothing to do with feeding the world. It only has to do with feeding profits of a few handful of people in the world who are really powerful, but it has nothing to do with feeding the world. We could grow all the food we need without tearing down rainforest. But we're cutting down the Amazon and Indonesia and increasingly in the Congo for things like animals, for cattle in the Amazon, for animal feed being shipped to China and elsewhere in the world from soybeans, and things like palm oil. We don't need to do that. And if we stop deforestation, all of that carbon that was going to go up in smoke never got burned. And all of the benefits happen on day one. That's a big climate win, but it's also the single best thing we can do for biodiversity, too, and also improving watersheds and a lot of lives of people living in terrible, smoky conditions, and a lot of the indigenous people who live in these areas whose lands are often stolen for these deforestation areas. So I think it's one of the top priorities, not only for climate, but also biodiversity and human well-being you could imagine. And it's cheap, it's fast, it's effective, and it's right here today. And now we know exactly where to go. So you're going to hear a lot more about deforestation from us in the coming year as well. I think it's a very underappreciated part of the climate puzzle. It's not just solar panels, people. It's a lot of things.
Thanks, John. Yeah, as you probably imagine, a lot of folks were asking what they can do, and there's interest in what the Explorer will look like, specifically how we envision the Drawdown Explorer, which, as you mentioned, will come out in mid 2025. How do we imagine that working regionally to help drive climate action in people's more regional and local lives?
Mhm. Well, the Drawdown Explorer, I'm very, very excited about this because until now, all the work done on kind of trying to identify the best climate solutions were kind of limited by the available data. We didn't have that much data yet on how different climate solutions really performed in the real world. So the best work on this in the world, our work, work you'll see in the IPCC, the International Energy Agency, there are a couple other organizations who do this pretty well. They show global numbers, just one number for the whole world, averaging it all together, as if solar panels on Earth all perform the same way, because we only had, a handful of data points at first. And sometimes because the policy making at the UN level was talking about what the world could look like in 2050, we not only have like just a big global number, sometimes we talk about it between now and 2050 as if that's the window we're all deciding upon. But it turns out in the real world, that's not how things happen. In the real world, people are building climate solutions today, not in the 2050. They're doing it now or the next year or two. They want to have information that's relevant right now. And they're doing it in their backyard. There is no global average place. They're doing it in particular places, whether it's Alaska or Minnesota or Paris or Australia, whatever. So now that there's more and more data available, and we're using kind of data mining techniques, big data and machine learning to scour the world for data on climate solutions and then begin to map them, we're now just able to make some of the first kind of crude, admittedly, maps of how different climate solutions actually would perform in your part of the world. So the Drawdown Explorer is going to showcase all of this stuff. It's going to show the effectiveness of climate solutions across the world and give you all the data. All the data will be available, interactive, and downloadable at a click of a button. Also, the cost of climate solutions, the scale and adoption of climate solutions, what's happening right now in the world today, that will be available, and the click of a button is yours. But also, for the first time, geographic details about, hey, how's this playing out in different regions? No one's ever done that before, but we're chomping at the bit doing this stuff. It's a lot of hard work, thousands and thousands of hours per solution, but we're getting it done. And it's going to be launched in June, come hell or high water. And we'll be also constantly updating it and analyzing it along the way. Also, we're trying to make it much more actionable with specific recommendations for what can businesses do? What can policymakers do? What can communities do? What can individuals and families do with every single solution? Not leaving you hanging like, that sounds great. Now, how can I do something? We're actually going to show a little bit of like, hey, here's some places where you might get started. You, the business leader, you, the community leader, you, just regular person like me, and you, whatever. All these things will be there as well, along with a lot more about these so-called co-benefits of climate action, showcasing solutions that not only help us with climate change, but help preserve nature and improve the human condition around the world too, because that might be the key to unlocking even more attention to climate solutions. So that's really exciting. It'll come out in June, and we're going to be evolving it and constantly updating it. but it's focused on the near term now. We're not talking about 2050 anymore in distant scenarios. We're focusing on actionable, real world stuff we can do. And it's going to be a first for the world. And we're really, really excited about that. In terms of what other folks can do here, we always love to hear from you. So the comments and questions you have coming in, Elizabeth can put in the chat. We do have ways of engaging us. But I'd actually encourage you all, if you could, to stay informed about what we're doing and keep in touch. Sign up for our newsletter, for example, would be great. Follow us on social media. We deliberately quit Twitter, X, because of it becoming basically a den of disinformation. But we're very active on LinkedIn and Instagram and on Blue Sky, a new, much more kind of information-rich place. We lost a lot of followers on Twitter when we deliberately deleted our accounts there. I did too, but it was the right thing to do. So we need help, word of mouth, spreading the word about what we do. And also, maybe it's a time of year for people to think about their finances and taxes and things. We also need donations. We definitely need financial support. We have thousands of small donors who maybe chip in $20 here or $50 there. If you're so inclined, we certainly would appreciate the help. And for those of you in the US, you also can get a tax deduction for that. And that's easily found on our website as well. So would welcome that, but we do the work no matter what. We'll try to keep going, but we definitely need support.
Great. Thanks so much, John. I try to keep up a bit with the newsletter, sign up in the chat. And remember, we'll send all these links as well as all of our social handles and ways to give. We really are grateful for folks like you who are supporting the work at Project Drawdown and climate work in your communities. John, one last thing. A number of questions about what brings you hope. What are you looking forward to in 2025?
A lot of people ask me that. When you work in climate change, that's always the number one question. Like, how do you get up in the morning? How do you stay at least sane and maybe hopeful on occasion? And I'll admit, there are days I get down. It's a mixed bag. There are things that are getting worse, and there are things that are getting better. But I take a lot of inspiration in history that every generation have faced incredible challenges, some that we could never even imagine. And so I look at all the heroes, not only in the world today, but in our past, in our family history, going back through thousands of generations in the past, how people time and time again faced a fork in the road of the world could get worse, or we could imagine a better world and move there. And we ultimately always do. It's bumpy and there's great tragedy and loss along the way. But at the end of the day, I am inspired by the human capacity to do well, to do good, and to finally, after lots of mistakes and lots of bumps and bruises along the way and lots of tragedy, we usually end up trying to do the right thing. So I'm inspired by that, that at the end of the day, when we come together, when we are the best people we could ever be, when we stand up to be the best versions of ourselves, like so many of our ancestors have done before us, we can do incredible things. And it's often when our backs are against the wall that we stand up taller than ever and do the best work we've ever seen. And I believe, honestly, this might be one of those moments. Maybe this is the moment we do stand together, we do stand up, and we change the world. And honestly, the only way we can do that is by doing this together. We cannot abdicate this to some elected leader in a jet someplace to save us. It's not going to happen that way. We all have to take responsibility of consciously creating the future we want and that the future generations of this planet deserve from us. So with that, I'd ask you all to try to join us in whatever way you can and any way we can together, go make that world a possibility and hand that to the future.
Thanks so much, John. Happy holiday season to everyone. In May 2025, be the time when we all stand up and work collectively together to stop climate change. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you all. Thanks so much.